Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm just going to let you, Andrew, tell us a little bit about, give us your elevator speech up and down about this book.
Oh dear. Well, first, thank you, Ellen, for being here and doing this. And I want to give a shout out to Malaprops. They've been through a pandemic, a hurricane. I mean, these people have been through the ringer. We all have, but I just want to have a round of applause for all of those who work here. I thank Patricia and Katie for putting out the chairs, and Stephanie, who is a rock here at Malaprops. Well, let's see. It all started out very innocently. An editor called me up and said, we need a story for Black History Month for a magazine. And well, I don't really have anything. And I happened to be in Williamsburg, which is the colonial capital of Virginia. I took my mother there to spend a day or so during the pandemic. She was stir crazy in her apartment. And when I was there, I was in a bookstore and I ran across a mention of Lord Dunmore. And I thought, Lord Dunmore, yeah, I know this guy. He was the villain of my childhood. He was the guy who burned down my hometown of Norfolk, Virginia. He was the guy who tried to stop the revolution in Virginia. He was the great enemy of George Washington, who called him that arch traitor to the rights of humanity. I mean, this was as bad as you get. I mean, this guy was really, when I was a child growing up, we would go to the cemetery at the old colonial church and look up at the wall, and there was a cannonball that was stuck in the wall of this colonial church. And underneath was a plaque that said, fired by Lord Dunmore, January 1st, 1776. I mean, how are you going to argue with that, right? Well, turns out that's not the whole story. So I discovered that he created what was called the Ethiopian Regiment, a regiment of enslaved Black people he freed and gave weapons to fight the patriots. And I thought, I grew up in a very, very history-minded family, and I had no idea. No one told me about that. No one told me about emancipation. No one told me about enslaved people being freed and fighting patriots. I mean, that went against everything that I thought had happened. And of course, Thomas Jefferson was the saint to Dunmore's villain, right? He was the guy who was the good guy. He was the one who wrote the Declaration, who brought us into the modern age and out of this, horrific empire, the British Empire. Imagine. So I was a little confused when I ran into this information, and I thought, all right, it's time to dig into it. So I just became a little obsessive, and I started to dig in, and I discovered that Lord Dunmore actually is not the guy that we thought he was. And why does this matter? Well, it matters because we really don't tell the story of what happened in the South at the beginning of the Revolution. Why? Because the story of Lexington and Concord, of New England farmers who are fighting these redcoats, it's such a great heroic story, an easy one to tell. We all know that story. But I became curious, why is it that we don't hear about the South? And we hear about the end, Yorktown, right? That was the end of the war in Virginia, but we don't hear about the beginning. So I began to dig into this character, Lord Dunmore, to find out more. And I discovered that he was really the victim of a really vitriolic, racist campaign of denigration that fooled the people of Virginia at the time and also fooled historians for several centuries. In fact, when I went to the American Revolution Museum in Philadelphia, there was a little plaque saying, yes, indeed, Lord Dunmore had burned Norfolk, Virginia on January 1st, 1776. But I discovered it wasn't true. It was all false. The patriots blamed him, but they set the city on fire, which arguably was the greatest single war crime in the American Revolution. Every single building of this 8th largest port in America was burned. So I kept digging and digging and realized that there was a myth here that needed unpacking, and that I really wanted to get at the truth, or truth, that's a complicated word. Let's say I wanted a more accurate picture of what actually happened. And no scholar, to my amazement, had actually looked at the day-to-day life of Dunmore to see what happened in those critical years of 1775 and 1776. So my obsession just took me to lots of archives and places, and it was amazingly difficult to find some of this material. You'd think anything about the American Revolution would be online or easy, but I found it was a pretty tangled knot. So I spent some time untangling that. And in the end, and we'll have a conversation about this, I discovered that there's more to this story than a villain who needs to be considered a good guy now, because that's not the story. The story is that many of the controversies that we see in the headlines today, and I mean today, go back to that critical moment in Virginia, which was the largest, most populous, wealthiest colony. Without Virginia, there would have been no revolution. There would have been no independence. So to look at why Virginia went for independence is critical to understanding who we are and how we became a nation, and also to understanding these issues like gun control, the role of the federal government, immigration, and of course, race. So all of these things seem to unspool as I was going through the archives, and I realized that this is a book that I think actually has some relevance for today, but I'll let you decide that.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So I want to say before I ask you the first question, yesterday, historian Alexis Coe published a highly complimentary review of the book in the New York Times. And when you and I first met, we were connected by Hugh Talbot, who is here tonight. And when you and I first met about 3 years ago, and you were talking about this idea about Lord Dunmore, and I thought, I'm an early Americanist. And I thought, well, okay, yeah, and he's a pretty good author, but he's not a historian. So Alexis Coe yesterday in her review said he isn't a historian, but when it comes to research, he does an excellent impression of one. And I agree. This is an amazing book. It's a real page turner. You got to get one before you go. But first, it truly is a fresh perspective on Lord Dunmore, and what you have ferreted out is fascinating. You've already told us a little bit about your impression of Lord Dunmore before and after you conducted your research. We can always go back to that, but there's so much more to this story. I'd like to start, although race is sort of obvious and we'll get to that, I'd really like to start with the gender roles. You are very intentional about including Lady Dunmore and her influence, her authority in your narrative. You feature the correspondence of several other women, just sort of, kind of ordinary-ish women. You ferreted out the actions of Jane Thompson, who was a free woman of color. And that's very hard to do. So kudos to you. And I'd really like to know why the inclusion of women's voices and actions were important to you in this book.
Well, I didn't set out to give women a voice, but as I was going through the documents, which tend to be letters from people like Washington or Dunmore, who did I mention? Royal Governor of Virginia, appointed by King George III in 1771. He actually was governor of New York, and they sent him down to Virginia. He didn't want to go. He said, oh my God, that place, fevers, there's no society. So he ended up there and became very, very good friends with people like Washington. Just wanted to mention that. So the women in that time, there were many educated women, but we don't have a lot of their letters. But I discovered that there were all of these journals and letters that had been written, particularly by Scottish women, that had been largely ignored largely by the male historians who were writing about battles, right? Battles and political strategy. And what I was interested in was getting a day-to-day scene of what did this place look like? What were the decisions people were facing? How did ordinary people caught up in this civil war, which is what it was? How did they make decisions? What was their motivation? And the women were just amazing in their kind of straightforward description of what was really happening. So it was just a treasure trove that was there. It wasn't hard to find these things really, but had just simply not been drawn on. And when it comes to Jane Thompson, so Jane and Talbot Thompson were the only people in colonial Virginia. There were a couple who not only bought their freedom, but they convinced the governor and his council to free them. Only happened to 2 people. So they're an extraordinary couple that lived in Norfolk, Virginia. and set up a business, and they both were, incredible collaborators and became quite wealthy. So again, it was a piece that had been left out, I think, by historians who tend to focus on military and political matters. I really wanted to see what was the city of Norfolk like, what was the situation with enslaved people. It was actually far more complex than I anticipated.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up with that, Lady Dunmore she figures quite, you talked about how Lord Dunmore was sort of pulled away from New York and down into that cesspool of Virginia. And she had a lot of influence in his career.
Yeah, she was actually the one who got him the job in the first place. Her sister married somebody in Britain, and Dunmore was a pretty poor, as aristocrats go, pretty poor Scottish aristocrat from the Highlands, didn't have much money, needed a job. And so his wife's sister married well, and that is how he got the position that he did, which is particularly interesting given that this man, Lord Dunmore, his father was a traitor. He had been actually convicted of treason for trying to overthrow King George II during the Jacobite Rebellion. And Dunmore actually was there when this all happened, but he was a teenager. So Dunmore, interestingly enough, had almost a master's class in how to rebel against a king. So here he is in Williamsburg, in the colonial capital, confronting suddenly a rebellion against the king.
So now I guess we ought to talk a little bit about the racial dynamics, because that's so important. Dunmore founded this Ethiopian regiment. You can just imagine, I mean, this is this proclamation that Dunmore made, how the patriots reacted, these enslavers reacted to this. They were terrified. And so this proclamation that promised to free any enslaved person who joined the British military was terrifying. Can you tell us a little bit more about the dynamics of race, black and white relationships in this moment in history?
Well, keep in mind that 4 out of 10 Virginians were enslaved. So nearly half of the population worked mainly on tobacco plantations. What we call plantations, they were really forced labor camps that were run by white families. I mean, it was a grim world that we tend to cover up with our 19th century romanticism around plantation culture, right? So if you go back to that time, it was a very brutal period where people who were enslaved had very little chance of getting out of lifetime servitude. You had a baby, automatically that child was going to be enslaved, even if that child was the half-child of a white enslaver. So this is a really nasty system that metastasized, of course, later and became a much larger system that spread into this area and then spread to Alabama, Mississippi, what have you. So that's the context. And the big fear of white Virginians, whether they were wealthy or not, and remember, most Virginians who were white owned at least one slave. I mean, it wasn't like people had hundreds of slaves. Almost everybody would have 1 or 2, with a few exceptions. So the big fear was that enslaved people would rebel, that you would be in your house and your enslaved person would come in at night and slit your throat or poison you or shoot you. So this was this incredible fear that pervaded Virginia. So when Lord Dunmore, faced with this problem, I've got all these rebels to deal with. All the troops are in Boston, 500 miles to the north. What's a guy to do? He doesn't have troops. And he could have run. He could have fled like the North Carolina governor did and other governors. They just hightailed it away. But Dunmore realized that if he emancipated those enslaved people, that they would flock to him. And actually, they were the ones that forced the issue, because they're the ones that arrived when he fled to Norfolk in 1775. He had to leave Williamsburg. So they're the ones, interestingly enough, who pushed him in this direction. It wasn't like the Lord of the Manor said, "Oh, I will free you." It was more like these people kept arriving, and the patriots were getting more and more pissed off. And finally, Dunmore realized his only hope was to get these people on his side, to give them arms and have them fight, particularly since a patriot army led by our friend Patrick Henry was moving to Norfolk to destroy Lord Dunmore and this multiracial army that he created.
And so the next question is, okay, so he's freeing all of these rebels, enslaved people, but what about the loyalists, enslaved people? What about his own enslaved people?
Yeah, and this is where, and it's interesting because Dunmore has been so vilified, even from people, I'll say historians who, aren't focused on his story. They will always come up with this question. It's like, well, he was just using them. He didn't really care about them, right? And to that I respond, well, that's exactly what white Southerners said in 1863 when Lincoln put out the Emancipation Proclamation. They said, he's using these people. The slaves were told, do not join the new Northern Army because this is all the ruse. So it's interesting to see history repeating itself. Dunmore was a complex character who owned enslaved people, but I think over time he grew to respect their boldness, their courage, because remember, he's sitting in Norfolk, the Patriots are in Williamsburg, and all these enslaved people are spread across Virginia in these very mostly remote forced labor camps. So for them to get to this port city, that alone was an incredibly dangerous act. And if they got caught, imprisonment, torture, and possibly death. And these were decreed by Virginia law. So these people, when they left, and there were hundreds and probably thousands, our numbers are not clear, but certainly more than 1,000 people fled from all over. Some came from Massachusetts, some came from Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and they came to find freedom. So this is what I think inspired Dunmore to realize that, hey, these guys have what it takes. And he was a Scottish Highlander. These are tough mountain men. And he understood, I think, the mentality of enslaved people because the Scots were treated rather poorly by the English. The English looked at them as barbaric, and even as not even part of the English race. So I think Dunmore, because of being part of the other, he was able to see these people as people. Now, of course, this is an evolution that happened over time. He freed most of his slaves, we think. We don't really know. So it's a complicated picture, but compare it to the founding fathers. Only George Washington freed his enslaved people, and then only after his death. So I think that when we're making comparisons, we need to be honest about what the Patriots were doing when we criticize Dunmore.
Yeah, and I want to one more sort of comment question about that, because you just mentioned George Washington, and he kind of sort of freed those slaves in his will, but after the war, there were a certain number of his enslaved people who left to join the British Army, and he actually asked for them back.
Yeah, this is one of the most shameful episodes in American history, and I didn't understand it. When the war was over, there was a Treaty of Paris where the British agreed to give back all the property they'd taken from the Patriots. And the Patriots understood that to mean the enslaved people. There were thousands of them, and I mean maybe 10,000 of them, who had gone to British lines, had been freed, and were working for the British. Suddenly, the British lose the war, and the British are leaving. What's going to happen to these people? And George Washington actually hired a slave catcher to go into New York when it was still controlled by the British to get some of the slaves that had been taken, had fled to Dunmore back in 1775 and 1776. And it's interesting, there was a British memo that I found that said, George Washington is no better than a robber. That he was they saw him as this really devious person who was doing everything he could to get back his property, and he didn't care about the liberty of these people. Whether you agree with that or not, it's another matter, but I think it's interesting to have that perspective. So Dunmore, and I want to mention this, that Dunmore's world ended in a way when he left Virginia. So he and the Ethiopian regiment were defeated in 1776, actually just really a few days after the Declaration was signed. So he sails with his men up to, and there were women and children too, to New York, where they continue to fight for the British during the course of the war. Dunmore goes back to England and he makes a big stink and says, we've got to free these people. We've got to use these people. It's the only way we're going to win the war. And the king really wouldn't listen to him. The slave owners who were in the West, who had West Indies plantations, they were scared that the rebellion would spread. So the British weren't about to do that, but they didn't negate Dunmore's Emancipation Proclamation. And so I would argue that that set in motion what became the abolitionist movement. And ultimately, of course, Abraham Lincoln's more famous Emancipation Proclamation, which in many ways is extremely similar. I mean, I think that he cribbed from it. And even then, in the 1860s, there were Southerners who actually remembered Dunmore, and they were terrified that Lincoln was going to do this. So to me, this thread running through American history makes Dunmore, as one historian argues, you could even consider him a founder, because he helped to put us on the course that this nation needed to be on far sooner than it did.
And we've kind of had that conversation, haven't we? That maybe if he'd been there for just a little bit longer, maybe he would have turned. I don't know whether you want to pursue that, but I think it's a really intriguing kind of counterfactual question. Yeah, yeah. So one thing that might surprise you all, maybe not, when you do read this book, is the role that guns played in Virginian leaders' strategies for the war. And I want to read, Andrew doesn't like to read in his readings. So I'm
Been there, done that.
Right, yeah. So I'm gonna read. It's a little awkward to be doing all of the things here, turning the pages.
Do you want me to hold on?
No, I think
Okay.
I got it. I think I got it. I'm ambidextrous. So just to sort of set this is from page 110 in the chapter entitled Virginia's Rubicon. And I'll set the context here. It's May of 1775, right after Lexington and Concord. Things are really heating up. Dunmore is threatening to reduce the rebels in Virginia's houses to ashes if they don't back down. So Patrick Henry, who Andrew has already mentioned, give me liberty or give me death. He did say that, and he was certainly a hawk. I'm going to read Andrew's description of Patrick Henry here. The famed orator, or this is sort of Patrick Henry's motivation here. He's sort of taking advantage of Dunmore's threats to rile up Virginians. And Andrew writes, the famed orator saw in Dunmore's words and actions a way to engage the colony's vast majority of white inhabitants, mostly small farmers, planters, and laborers, who remained largely on the quarrel's sidelines. Okay, so that's Henry's motivation. And then I'm going to skip down to this next paragraph and just read it. Henry was a successful trial lawyer who had traveled the colony's rough back roads. Unlike most of Virginia's gentry, he understood that his clients cared little about taxes and tariffs. And then Andrew quotes Patrick Henry in a letter to a friend of his. You may in vain talk to the people about the duties on tea, etc. These things will not affect them. They depend on principles that the duties on tea, etc. They depend on principles too abstracted for the Virginians' apprehension and feeling. But tell them of the robbery of the magazine, their arms, and that the next step will be to disarm them. You bring the subject home to their bosoms, and they will be ready to fly to arms to defend themselves.
Yeah, this quote
Guns?
is astonishing. It's astonishing.
Guns?
It unmasks what's really going on. So, the most white farmers, they didn't even drink tea. They didn't care. They weren't trading with England. They were really self-sufficient mostly. So here you have Patrick Henry, like, what are we going to do? We've got to rile these people up, because the gentry wanted to be independent, or they were moving that way. Why? Because they wanted land, and the land was west. The land was west of, when you cross over 26, you cross the Continental Divide. That was a line, the Royal Proclamation line. King George III said no white settler can legally own property on this side. And that really upset people like George Washington and Patrick Henry, who were big land speculators. So this was really the Virginians' reason, not tea, but land. The British were preventing them from moving west. Why? Because the British didn't want a nasty war with the Indians. You know, they knew the indigenous people were there. They were kind of under George III's sovereignty. They wanted to leave them where they were, not cause trouble. But of course, the white colonists who were growing tobacco, which wears out the soil, had to keep moving west. It was an economic system that required constant, the appetite was endless. So this was really the motivation for people like Patrick Henry. And of course, local farmers, they could care less about that. They weren't speculators. They might go west, but they didn't need to have a certificate from the king saying it was legal. And so this is a very clever way for Patrick Henry to scare the hell out of white Virginians. By saying the British were going to take their guns, that meant that at night, when you went to bed, your wife and your children were not safe because those enslaved people could come and get you. So this was such a deep-seated fear that I mentioned earlier that Patrick Henry was really smart. You know, he saw that this is a way to turn the situation to the advantage of the Virginia gentry by getting the farmers who they needed to fight the British on their side. And it was incredibly effective. It was so effective that Patrick Henry went on to write the draft of the Second Amendment. So, you know, this line that goes right up to the controversies today is so evident from this quote.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Great.
And I know that one of the things that is dear to your heart, but really, you know, when you think about the things, when we think about the things that happened during the Revolution, as you pointed out earlier, we think about the Battle of Bunker Hill, we think about Lexington and Concord, we think about the Tea Party, we don't really think about the stuff that happened in Virginia during the war. And I know that one of the things that wounds you the worst is that the burning of Norfolk. And there was this sort of, I mean, it's complicated, right? Because there was this urban rural dynamic going on,
Yeah.
and you do such a good job of sussing that out. And now that I've started to ask this question, I'm wondering if you can answer it in 5-ish minutes. But I'm just wondering why was it so important to you to write a book about the burning of Norfolk, or in part about that?
And I appreciate the way you're trying to say it, the way a local says it. Yeah, I do.
I was trained by a Williamsburger down at the
Okay, great. Yeah, so again, we talk about guns, we talk about race, and then there's this urban-rural divide, which of course in this country is huge, on which many elections have turned. And to my amazement, I discovered that divide was happening in Virginia in 1775. So it wasn't happening in New England. This is really an exclusively Southern thing, which now we're kind of saddled with. So why it was important? Okay, I was taught that the nasty Scottish aristocrat burned Norfolk to the ground in order to prevent American independence. When I learned that was patently false, I was really curious. Well, why? Why would they do that? And I even found a quote from Marshall, the first Supreme Court justice, or the most famous Supreme Court justice, who was actually there. He was part of the Patriot Army, and he said, years later, when he was on the Supreme Court, he said, you know, sometimes things happen for really bad reasons, and this was a really bad thing. That the Patriots burned their own city. The British could not even believe that people would destroy their own metropolis. But Norfolk was different. It was a place where the Scottish merchants were, very wealthy Scottish merchants. The English didn't like the Scots, and they were treated like Jews. They were seen as Jews. They were seen as money grubbers, as tight-knit families. They were taking away the money from the hard-working planters. So that was one strike against Norfolk. The other was that the enslaved people there actually were running the economy. They were working on ships. They were running warehouses. They were incredibly competent. They were the pilots of the ships. That's the most difficult job of all, to make sure your ship doesn't ground in the complex waters of Chesapeake Bay. So they really had a different world. They were still enslaved people, mostly, small free Black community, but they lived in a very different way, an urban kind of enslavement that was very different from the really particularly nasty forced labor camp sort. So this also riled the patriots, because the patriot gentry kept finding out that their slaves would slip away even before the war and go to Norfolk, where you could, hide out, you could forge papers, you could get a job on a ship with very few questions asked. So it was seen as a hole that needed to be plugged in the slave system of Virginia. So that was another strike against it. And then, of course, it was a city with strategic value because it has one of the best ports in America. So the Patriots were loath to let the British control that. So for all of these reasons, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to a friend in November of 1775, a month before the destruction, and it said at the bottom, "Delenda est Norfolk," which was a classical reference to the Romans who had destroyed Carthage. Delenda est Carthago was what a Roman senator said. And we know the Romans destroyed Carthage completely and utterly on a surprise attack, and they enslaved everybody, burned everything down. And Jefferson actually writes these words. So he's calling for a war crime. He's calling for the destruction of a city where probably most of the people were not politically interested. They were merchants. They just wanted to keep living their lives. So, this was really shocking to me, to find out that this person that I had grown up feeling was a kind of secular saint actually was one of the masterminds of what was a horrific crime. And I detail in the book what happened during the burning, including a woman who's pregnant, who's giving birth, and the patriots burst into her room and demand to have proof that she's a good patriot before they decide not to burn her house down. I mean, it was the brutality of what happened. All, not just troops that were running amok, but all ordered by the Virginia Convention, by the Patriots. So, this was really hit me hard because there's nothing left. There were 1,333 buildings. Think of Charleston. Think of Annapolis. Think of Savannah. There's not a single building except for the church, and just the walls were left of that, left standing. It was really shocking. There's one chimney I found behind a lawyer's office that they use for barbecues now, that probably is from a colonial church, a colonial home. So the extent of this has been ignored, mostly I think because it was an inconvenient truth. And it was important because the destruction of Norfolk meant that people who were on the fence about joining the Patriots decided, well, hell, if the British are burning our cities, we've got to get rid of the British. We've got to fight them. So Washington himself says that the burning arguments of Norfolk would help push people to go with independence. So again, this was really critical in the founding of the country.
Yeah, and the way that you tell a story is compelling. It's a real page turner, and I won't. Well, I guess we know the end of the story, right? So
maybe we don't.
Maybe
as Mal supposedly said when he was asked about the outcome of the French Revolution, he allegedly said it's too early to say.
So as a legal and constitutional historian, I just got to say, I hope we don't know the end of the story. Okay, so but the story goes on, right? Yeah, and so I want to sort of circle back to he's not a historian point earlier, because I think it's kind of a good thing. It's a good thing to have a you've done a lot of really great research in your other books also, so you know how to do that. And I am so impressed with the research that you've done, but you're seeing all of these incidents with fresh eyes, not like those of us who've been teaching this for decades and studying it and doing research and publishing about it. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us how we should think about the Revolution now, given what we know?
Well, there's an open-ended question. Well, first of all, I'm not really interested in history. I'm interested in stories. I'm interested in the stories that we tell that, make meaning. Like the story that I was taught as a kid helped me to understand why my city had been destroyed, and gave a villain. And, it was a very simple story. And I just think that after 250 years, it'll be 250 years this year, well, for the beginning of the revolution, that it's time to actually look at our myths and be real about them. Because if we're going to understand these controversies that keep coming up, we've got to understand where it all started. So that's my interest, is in finding the stories about how it got started, the origin stories of our country. So this is one of them. And I'm less interested in the academic nature of that. I want to get it right, but mainly I want to tell a good story that's accurate.
That is what you have done. Yes. So I think we can open it up to audience questions.
And again, a round of applause, please, for a perfect presentation. To the Q&A portion of our event, we will include the virtual audience, and I'll just kind of toggle back and forth. But live audience, I'm sure you can bring the first question. Be the point of the spirit. Oh, there's a hand that's almost up already. Okay, go right ahead. And Ellen, you've made a solemn pledge to repeat the question.
On my honor.
Have mercy on the repeater. And you have a soliloquy, and then a preamble, and then a follow-up and a comment, and then buried within that is a question. Think about Ellen and what she's got to remember. Okay, so have a bit of mercy.
My preamble is I'm glad that you are not a historian, because I love storytelling and and you talked about the enslaved people that work for the British, and some of them may have been freed or not. But how about the enslaved people that fought with the patriots?
Yeah.
Okay,
So I'm repeating the question. So the question is a really good one, and I will also repeat the compliment that she loves storytelling, and she's glad you're not a historian also. And then you asked a question about, so you talked about the enslaved people who fought with the British. What about the enslaved people, or the people of color who fought with the patriots?
Well, 2 weeks after, it was about a month after Lord Dunmore issued his Emancipation Proclamation, George Washington suddenly had a change of heart. He got news of this proclamation that enslaved people were going to be freed and join the British Army. And so he suddenly decided, I think we will take Black people in our army after all. And it had a profound effect, because lots and lots of people not enslaved, he wouldn't accept enslaved people into the Continental Army, only free Black people. There were some exceptions, but mostly that was the case. So for the most part, the people who were of color, who fought for the Americans, for example, the famous Rhode Island Regiment that was almost all Black and fought at Yorktown quite bravely, they were people who were able to become veterans. And in becoming veterans, they were able to, after the war, really push for their rights. So there were lots of them that fought for the Americans, and they never really got the credit that they were due. There were some in Virginia, but again, they were mostly, from what we know, freed people who decided to join for many reasons. But American history, as it's been written until recently, has been all about those people. Why? Because a lot of Black historians in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s were writing the story of Black people in the Revolution, and they didn't really want to talk about the ones who fought for the British. They were trying to get across, we're patriots too. We helped found this country. So we kind of ignored the vast majority of people who were of color, who fought for the British as opposed to the American story, because that's a nice story that makes us feel good. And also was a way for Black people to feel integrated into a society that had so rejected them.
I don't have a question yet from the virtual audience. They may be a little shy. So as a result, quick draw over here. Gets the next one.
I'm looking forward to reading your book, but I was just asking, I'm really curious about the intersection between Jefferson and Dunmore, because Jefferson was mentored by a previous royal governor, is my understanding. And then I wondered, like Jefferson ate at the governor's house a lot, historically. What was that overlap between them?
So the question was about the intersection between Jefferson and Dunmore. And is that what you asked, John? You were looking at me like, no, that's not
No,
right.
it's okay. No, I'm
Okay,
sorry.
all right.
Yeah, I'm just tired. Sorry.
Yeah. So
And how now I've forgotten the rest of the question. But just what was the relationship between Jefferson and Dunmore?
well, this is a very interesting story because we know that George Washington and Dunmore were really good friends because Washington left a diary that said every time he went to eat in the palace. So you can't really deny that relationship, although historians have mostly ignored it. But Jefferson's is a little trickier because for reasons that are unclear, he never mentions the governor. Now, we don't have a lot of his letters from that period. I'm not saying that those letters got lost, but maybe it might have been inconvenient for his correspondence with the governor to come to light. What we do know is that Lord Dunmore asked Jefferson to build an extension to the College of William and Mary. And we have in Jefferson's own hand, Lord Dunmore asked me to do this plan. So Dunmore was Jefferson's first architectural patron. And I think that they also worked together to plan a renovation of the governor's palace, where Jefferson later lived when he was governor. So I think that they had a very close relationship, probably briefly. Also, they were involved in some business ventures to grow grapes and bring Italian goods and products to the U.S., grow them in the area around Monticello. So it's clear that they were close, but then I think pretty quickly Jefferson becomes part of this cabal that is pushing against Britain, and I think they probably had a break. But we really know very little, except years later, Lady Dunmore's son, after Lord Dunmore's dead, goes to Jefferson when he's president and says, look, we're poor, we have no money, we lost everything when we left Virginia, can you help out? And Jefferson's like, oh, I'm so sorry. Why don't you go to Alexander Hamilton and see if you can get a hand there. So it's interesting that there is this connection later that clearly the Dunmores felt like they had a connection with Jefferson that they kept going back to him asking for money. So I think that hints, and I don't even mention this in the book, but I think that hints at a deeper relationship between the two that Jefferson really didn't want to remember. He wanted that forgotten.
How long did it take you from the idea to the book itself? How many years, months, whatever?
So the question was, how long did it take you to get from the idea to the book?
An eternity. Let's see. It began during the pandemic, so maybe 2021, I guess. And I just, I did some magazine stories. When I do a book, it's a very messy process because I freelance and I'm working on other books. So it was not full time until I actually got a book contract, and that was maybe 2 years ago, I guess. So basically, it took a year to kind of pull together the idea, and then a year to write it, and then a year to go through everything you got to go through to get it published. It's a sausage making process I really don't want to bore you with. And the fruition, of course, is tonight that it comes out. But in the meantime, I'm already working on ideas for other books. I'm doing presentations about past books. I'm freelancing. So, this is a wonderful event, but I kind of moved on in a sense because I'm eager to tell a new story, but I'm also eager not to write a diary. I want to get out and tell people what I found.
Yes. Lord Dunmore have the authority to emancipate those enslaved people, or
or did he have to ask permission first?
It's a really good question. And the question was, did Lord Dunmore have the authority to emancipate these people, or did he have to ask for permission?
Well, great question. So the answer is technically no, he didn't have the authority, but he kept writing to Britain saying, hey, I want to do this. You think it's a good idea? Can I do this? Can I do this? But for 6 months, he got no letters from Britain. They just, the ships didn't arrive. So at one point, he wrote a letter saying, hey, I'm sorry, I haven't heard from you. I'm hoping it's okay. I'm going to do this. So he gave them plenty of warning, like 6 months of warning, and didn't hear back. So he just took the step himself. And what's interesting is what happened after, because the patriots all assumed, oh, well, the British Parliament is full of slave owners. They're gonna squash this. They're gonna say, Dunmore, you're out of line. We recall you. How dare you do this? But interestingly, the success of the Black fighters for the British convinced enough people in Parliament not to go against Dunmore's proclamation. This is really important because they didn't quash it, because they accepted it by not rejecting it. That opened the path for other British generals later in the war to do similar kinds of proclamations. And ultimately, as I would argue in the book, that's what that helped to get abolitionism going. Because the British, of course, freed their enslaved people 30 years or so before the Americans did. And actually in England and Scotland, it was illegal much earlier. So they were definitely ahead of the curve in doing that. And the debate about whether or not to accept Dunmore's proclamations makes for fascinating reading, because you can see the tensions between people who say, this is a military value, these guys will fight hard, and those saying, yeah, but we're lighting a fuse. And they did, they lit a fuse.
One of the kind of concluding elements that I'm reminded of every time I hear Andrew give a presentation is how important it is to craft an incredibly compelling narrative and draw people in and find surprises and plot twists and reveals, the great reveals. And so I can't wait to see what Andrew's going to do next, but I would love it if it's going to be on Unity Mitford, whose diaries to Hitler and all of her secret pre-war meetings, because she was a British fascist of the Mitford sisters, have only been now revealed to the public. And we found that out about 10 or 11 days ago. And something else, of course, Alexis Coe, who did this great review of A Perfect Frenzy, she wrote a book, a biography of George Washington, and she understands, I think, Andrew's humor as well. And I know those of you who enjoy Andrew's writing and his camaraderie know that his wit is something that's infused in his work. And Alexis Coe's book about George Washington is entitled "You Never Forget Your First."
It's a great book.
So I would love it, Andrew, if you wouldn't mind making a concluding remark so that we can sign some books and chat further at the table.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming out on a winter night, although it feels like spring. And I guess, as we approach the 250th anniversary, I think this is a really, really good moment, given what's happening politically in this country, for us to really go back to that beginning, that origin, and rethink, who are we? Why are we the way we are? And I don't think we need to repeat what the Patriots did. I mean, it's like saying the Patriots would have acted like medieval knights, right? It's 250 years ago. Our values are different. Our country is different. So to be a patriot, as many of the January 6th insurrectionists argued, they said, we're patriots. And I argued in a recent article that, in fact, they are. But in some ways, that's not a good thing, because they brought, they carry with them the prejudices that we've been trying to get rid of for the course of this nation's history. So I think this is a really good time to get the conversation going. The best I can hope is that y'all will leave and go have a drink and talk about how you understand the revolution and what that means for the headlines that you see today. So again, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen.